Well, uh, so far we haven't really been talking about metaphysics or ontology. Of course, it's supposed to be on Sellars as a metaphysician. We've mostly been talking about language and then about mind. And at least in connection with mind, we saw some metaphysics, some ontology, where Sellars was objecting to the behaviorist rejection of the idea of inner episodes and saying, no, the notion of thoughts, the notion of sense impressions, those inner episodes, we can make perfectly good sense of those, and urge that we think of them as standing to behavior as theory stands to what's observable, and objected to the behaviorists as making the instrumentalist's mistake of thinking that theoretical entities were ontologically a different kind of thing than observable things were. And he insisted, no, it's just a difference in methodology, in epistemology. The way we find out about theoretical entities is different. We only have inferential access to them. We don't have the non-inferential observational access. But that's not an ontological difference. That's just a difference in the relation to us. But in the discussion of abstract entities, Sellars is on the other side. He's denying the existence of something, abstract entities. He's a nominalist, not a Platonist about these abstracta. He claims that no such things as universals, as propositions, are to be found in the world, as he says, in the narrow sense. There's a more general sense in which he thinks they do exist, and of course we'll have to worry about what he means by that narrow sense. But he's clear here he wants to deny the existence of universals and abstracta. Now, denying the existence of something is a particularly fraught kind of philosophical enterprise. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of Occam's razor, that the methodological dictum that one should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Maybe you haven't heard of its opponent, what Quine calls Plato's beard. He calls it that because it's what it's hardest to shave with Occam's razor, what is most likely to tangle it up. And specifically, he means non-existence claims, that claiming that something doesn't exist can, in a backhanded way, end up with you committed to the things you say don't exist. As soon as they ask, well, what is it that doesn't exist? You're liable to be embarrassed. The Austrian philosopher Franz Brentano, the one who brought the scholastic notion of intentionality back into modern usage, focused on the fact that I can praise John McDowell or think about him even if he isn't here, but I can't shake his hand unless he's here. I can search for a treasure even if there isn't a treasure, if it doesn't exist, but I can't find it, I can't weigh it or transport it unless it actually exists. The objects of our thoughts, he says, have intentional inexistence. And his student, Alexius Meinong, radicalized that thought about the wider range, wider realm of objects of thought, things we can think about or have beliefs about, be intentionally directed towards. His favorite example was a golden mountain made of pure gold. And he said all those things have to be thought of as subsisting rather than existing. And it was a question for him, what distinguished the proper subset among the wider realm of things we could think about? What distinguished the subset of them that really existed. And he was struck by the fact that often we can't tell whether the thing we're thinking about merely subsists or whether it actually exists. You may really think there's a treasure there. It turns out it's only an object of thought and search and intention. It doesn't really exist. You can't tell. So these things are intimately connected. We can be confused about what really exists. I'll mention as a bit of terminology that some people use the term me-ontology, M-E ontology, for the study of things that don't exist, or for ontological disputes about things that don't exist. Now, maybe most of Meinong's readers have thought that something has gone seriously wrong if you're thinking about this wider realm of merely subsistent beings, but what has gone wrong? Now, I raise this issue here because Quine, in his extremely influential essay, and it's actually a wonderful essay, on what there is from 1948, that I made available in the supplementary readings, starts off worried about Plato's beard, worried about the problem of non-existence and getting tangled in how you talk about that. And Sellars doesn't worry about that at all. He plunges in saying these things don't exist and doesn't worry about Plato's beard in the least, even though he's writing in full knowledge of Quine's worries about that in the essay that really set the agenda for doing ontology in the second half of the 20th century. And here again, I think, though Sellars simply does not address the issue, I think I understand why he's not worried about it. And that's his anti-descriptivism, whose counsel is, first think about what you're doing when you use a certain kind of expression. What are you doing when you deny that something exists? Don't start with trying to understand what you're saying, in particular, conceived on the model of how you're describing the world to be. That's the beginning of puzzles with Plato's beard. How are you describing the world to be when you describe it as not having a certain kind of thing in it? But the anti-descriptivist asks first the question in a pragmatic metavocabulary rather than that representational descriptivist semantic metavocabulary. What are you doing when you deny existence? And it's pretty clear what the answer should be. You're withholding an existential commitment. You can make an existential commitment by saying that something does exist, quantifying over it, for instance. But a non-existence claim, what you're doing is withholding that commitment. You're not making that commitment. Now, exactly what is an existential commitment? What are you committing yourself to? Well, that's going to be a big question with the nominalist. But the anti-descriptivist approach is to say that non-existence claims are to existence claims as merely looks talk is to is talk. You know how to commit yourself to how things are in is talk. When you say that things merely look that way, you're withholding commitment to them being that way. And similarly with non-existence claims, we should understand those as withholding a kind of commitment rather than undertaking commitment to a different kind of thing, a pseudo-existential commitment, a subsistential commitment. Meinong assumes that in denying the existence of something, you're describing things as having a certain property, as merely subsisting rather than existing. So I think the reason Sellars in his nominalism isn't concerned at all about Plato's beard is he thinks it's a descriptivist mistake that is of a piece with the Cartesian mistake about looks talk. So that's in a way a sort of minor point, a bit of ground clearing. I'm just putting that to one side. But because it connects with the Sellarsian anti-descriptivism, I thought it might be worth making. Yeah.
I just have a basic question about this that I don't understand. What's the difference then between saying, I don't know whether this exists, and saying this doesn't exist? It seems like the first one is withholding any commitment as to the existence, and the other one does something different.
Yeah, I mean, saying it doesn't exist isn't saying anything about your epistemic state. I mean, I think the difference there, is a matter of which kind of commitment is being withheld. So to say that something's true is one thing. To say I know that it's true, that's something more. That's not only to avow your belief in it, your awareness of it, but to claim a certain kind of ground, a certain kind of justification for it. And I could say I don't know, while not contesting in the least that it's true, but saying, well, but I don't have any evidence for it. I have no reason that would justify me in believing it. So I think there's more commitments involved in a knowledge claim than there is in an existence or just a truth claim. And so there's more that you could be withholding in that case. Well, more and less, as I say, you might say, I don't know, not because you don't think it exists, but because you don't know it. You don't have the grounds for it. I mean, I agree there's delicate work to be done there. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just like, I had to think, I was instinctively thinking it the other way around. I say, like, this exists, that is actually the committal thing, because my state of knowledge apparently is implicit in that. Like, I fully commit, well, if I say I know that it exists, that kind of qualifies it to my state of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant, that these are delicate.
Yes.
You can understand assertions as implicit claims to knowledge, not merely claims of truth. And that's what you're thinking about. But there still is, the original question is, what's the difference? Yeah, you're pointing, well, you could think of the one as stronger or the other as stronger, but still they're clearly different. And that's all the withholding claim needs. Okay, so as I say, that's merely a bit of ground clearing, but I think it's interesting that it doesn't occur to Quine to address the problem of Plato's beard with an anti-descriptivist move. He's only got the one semantics, he's only got the one kind of question. Now, in thinking about nominalism, there's a broader kind that addresses abstract objects, abstract entities. For next time, we'll read Sellars' early essay on empiricism and abstract entities, where he first, well, it's the only place I know where he discusses his motivation for being a nominalist. But you can also just be a nominalist about universals, things like triangularity that have instances that are triangles. And these are different, and Sellars addresses them differently. And I think the real action is on the side of universals, but we'll see he makes fine distinctions and has different attitudes towards different things. I want to start talking about abstraction rather than universals, even though in some sense the real action in Sellars' text has to do with the treatment of universals, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page in thinking about abstraction. I mean, philosophers famously deal with abstract ideas. deal with abstractions all the time. This way, you tell someone you're a philosopher and they say, oh, don't you care about anything, that actually matters? You're all up in the sky thinking of the Platonic sort of heaven of abstractions. But in my experience, a lot of philosophers don't think very much about abstraction, about what it is. In this, as in so many things, Frege is our guide. In his Grundlagen der Arithmetik, he gives us a paradigm of abstraction. He's going to introduce numbers by abstraction as thinking of them as abstract objects. But he wants to give us sort of simpler examples first. And he says, so imagine you've got a Euclidean plane and it has a bunch of lines on it. And you can already pick out the lines, say you've given them names. So you can already talk about lines. And one of the features that lines can have is they can be parallel to each other. Of course, lots of them aren't. If they're not parallel, they have a point of intersection. But there is this relation among lines, and we can describe lines as being parallel to one another. We can say line A is parallel to line B. And Frege says we can introduce on that basis an abstraction, the notion of the direction of a line. And we introduce it by saying the direction of line A is the same as the direction of line B. We can put an equal sign between the direction of line A and the direction of line B, just in case A and B are parallel. And he unpicks what he's doing here. Generically, he's introducing new vocabulary based on old vocabulary. We can talk about lines, we can talk about their being parallel, but he introduces the notion of the direction of a line. That's an abstract thing associated with the line. And all those directions of A, direction of B, those are of a kind, directions, which he's introducing all at once. And he does that and can do it because the relation of being parallel to is an equivalence relation. Algebraically, it's reflexive, it's symmetric, and it's transitive. So to say it's reflexive is to say that every line is parallel to itself. To say it's symmetric is to say if line A is parallel to line B, then line B is parallel to line A. And to say that it's transitive is to say that if line A is parallel to line B and line C is parallel to line B, then line C is parallel to line A. Those three properties are properties that identity has. So line A is identical to itself, and if A is identical, it's the same line as B, then B is the same line as A, and it has the transitive property too. But the notion of equivalence relations is wider than that of identity. Being parallel is an equivalence relation, but it's not an identity. Abstraction is introducing new vocabulary by treating equivalence relations as identities. And what they're identities between are the new abstract things that you've introduced. So we can say the direction of line A is the same as the direction of line B. And we've given truth conditions for that statement entirely in terms of lines in parallel. But that tells us how to identify and individuate these new kinds of things, directions, entirely in terms of the old kinds of things. And what you see in mathematics is as soon as you've introduced one level of abstract objects, these new kinds of abstract objects, you can define an equivalence relation on them and build new abstractions on top of them and build to the sky. That's the source of the peculiar sort of vertigo that learning new mathematics gives you. You've just sort of gotten a hold of one set of abstract things, and they say, okay, now take those and let us build something else out of them. So abstraction is a process. What you're doing when you engage in that process is introducing new vocabulary on the basis of old vocabulary. And in particular, you introduce new terms, both singular terms. The direction of line A is a definite description. That's a kind of singular term. And you introduce the sortals that go with it, directions. And you do that by treating equivalence relations, some particular equivalence relation, as an identity relation of the new things. So this is a very powerful technique. There's a temptation built into it for 20th century philosophers thinking about this, to say, oh, I understand what directions are. Directions are the direction of line A is the set of all the lines that are parallel to A. It's the equivalence class of A. That's a basic set theoretic construction. And you can think about directions as, or you can at least individuate them by the set of the direction of A as the set of lines that are parallel to A. After all, that set, the direction of A, is going to be the same set as the direction of B, just in case A is parallel to B, which is the criteria of identity and individuation for directions. So there's a temptation to identify the things you've introduced with the equivalence classes, with the sets of all the things that stand in that equivalence relation to the thing whose direction you're talking about. If you take that step, you're saying all abstract objects are sets, because what you're doing is introducing on this conception an equivalence class. And that means that when we ask whether they're abstract objects, we're really only talking about sets. The question is, are there sets? There aren't all different kinds of abstract objects. Everything that's introduced by abstraction is a set. They can differ in what the elements of the sets are. They could be lines. I just have another example. So some people have the same surname. One of the reasons, and that relation is an equivalence relation. You have the same surname as yourself. If someone else has the same surname as you do, then you have the same surname as they do, and it's transitive. Sort of only overlaps families. People can have the same surname and not be in the same family, can be in the same family and not have the same surname. But we can introduce the notion of Sir people by saying that two people are the same Sir person in case they have the same surname. That's an abstraction. You might think, well, there aren't really any Sir people. Well, I can point to it right there. Well, that's just an instance of a Sir person. This is the sort of issue that nominalists are going to be concerned about on this reductive set theoretic move that I put on the table. Sur people are just sets of people. A sur person is just a set of all the people who have the same surname. And if you make that move, then there's only one kind of abstract object in that sense. So you might as well just worry about sets. Goodman and Quine make that move without stopping to talk about it. They just assume that that's what abstract objects are. They're all sets. Now, one reason you might worry about that is that you could introduce the notion of a set by abstraction, using a relation of co-membership according to which everything is a co-member with itself, and if A is a co-member of B, then B is a co-member of A, and if A is a co-member of B and C is a co-member of B, then C is a co-member of A, and now say the set that's in A is the set relative to A is the same as the set relative to B, just in case they're co-members. So you could treat abstraction as more basic than the notion of set. I mean, that's a different way of introducing them than using the set theoretic epsilon, which invokes a relation between members and the set. But basically what you're doing when you form a set is abstracting from something like a co-membership relation. So I guess the point I want to make is you shouldn't rush into an identification of abstract entities with sets. That's a substantial move. That's a substantial commitment. It would require justification in doing it. I also point out that, as I've described it, as Frege does, abstract concrete, I should say, the terms in the vocabulary you start with, in the old vocabulary, lines, people, those are more concrete than the abstract terms you introduce on the basis of them. But that's a relative notion. As you climb the hierarchy of mathematical abstraction, you get to more and more abstract things. That is, terms you can only understand by looking at multiple rounds of abstraction. And so we could ask, well, but is there anything that's not abstract at all, that's absolutely concrete? And here the thought is, well, maybe material objects are. Maybe sort of material things are. And sets of them, and as were properties of them, properties like being co-members of something or having the same surname, those are absolutely concrete. Euclidean lines, probably not. Those are probably already abstract. When I talk about the Earth's axis and the direction of Earth's axis, think about the Earth's axis as the line around which the Earth rotates. That's already abstract. It's formed by looking at the equivalence relation of 2 points that are both on the axis if one of them doesn't move as the Earth rotates, then neither does the other one. You can define the Earth's axis from that. So lines that Frege started with, those are already abstract. Sur people, well, it depends on whether you think person is defined by abstraction, starting with people's bodies or whatever. If you think person is a normative concept, then you're going to be worried about whether norms are abstract relative to something more concrete. These are all the sorts of issues that Sellars' nominalism is going to raise. There doesn't seem to be any top to the abstraction hierarchy. You can always get more abstract. Again, just ask your favorite mathematician. But maybe there's a bottom. Maybe there's some terms that are not introduced by abstraction on the basis of other terms. A sort of question people ask, particularly in connection with looking for absolutely concrete objects, ones which don't involve any abstraction, are nowhere on this hierarchy, is, well, are they causally efficacious? There's sort of the view that abstractions don't exert forces, don't cause things to happen in the physical world. Now, I actually think that's a very difficult line to run. Two notions that I think of as very abstract are the notion of a field and the notion of a symmetry. So a field is represented anyway by assigning magnitudes of various kinds to the points of a manifold. So paradigmatically, you have a plane, and you assign to each point in the plane, the value of the electromagnetic force at it, the magnetism at that point. Think of it as a vector or as a scalar, either one. Really, electromagnetism we assign to each point in space rather than just a plane, a vector saying how the electromagnetic force is there. Any specification of fields is going to be very abstract. It's going to be an abstraction from other specifications. And yet, that's how we think of gravity and electromagnetism, other things that involve gauge invariant fields. That's one more complicated, but even in classical late 19th century mechanics, it's the fields that move everything around. Very difficult to talk about them without talking about them by abstraction from other things, from the movement of things, the positions of things, and so on. Again, one of the big conceptual transformations from 19th century physics to 20th century physics is the transformation from thinking in terms of laws of nature to thinking of symmetries. Von Frausten's book, Laws and Symmetries, is a classic accounting of this transformation. Symmetry preservation is what you invoke in explanation of physical phenomena. But symmetries, by definition, are abstract. They're invariants under some kind of permutation of something, and those permutations are equivalence relations. That's how you get to symmetries. But that's what we invoke in explaining things in fundamental physics, is fields and symmetries, which we introduce anyway by abstraction. There as, well, it's even more old-fashioned than talk about laws is to talk about causes of these things. But in our physical explanations, these are the things we invoke. So it's not evidently so easy to make a a case for terms that are introduced by abstraction not referring to things that make a difference to the movement of matter, for instance. But look, the overall lesson, well, lesson is too strong, but the point I would like to make is that, I've talked about the move from a term being introduced by abstraction to saying, oh, it refers to a set, and saying, careful, don't just thoughtlessly make that move anyway. That may or may not be a good move. I also want to say, it's not clear that talk about abstract objects or abstract entities is warranted here. And this is a question that I want to resonate through the next weeks as we discuss Sellars' nominalism. Abstraction is a process of introducing new terms from old ones. Does that mean that any term that's introduced by abstraction refers to a different kind of object than the objects that were referred to in the old vocabulary? That is, that there's a kind of object such that you can only come to refer to it by introducing terms by abstraction? Or is it possible that ways of introducing terms is one thing and ontological distinctions is another? After all, we have a model for that. Theoretical terms are introduced by postulation, by endorsing certain inferences involving observable and other theoretical entities. And Sellars was coming down as hard as it's possible to come down on the point that the fact that some terms are introduced that way by theoretical postulation in order to explain the antics of observable things doesn't mean that there's a special kind of thing that you're picking out by doing that. If it's a good theory, it can be a true theory, and there really are things like that, and it's just the way we came at them was inferentially. That's the only way we could justify claims about them. So it's one thing to say a term is introduced by abstraction. It's another thing to say, and there's a kind of thing, abstract entities, such that, well, what's their relation to terms that are introduced by abstraction? Such that every term that's introduced by abstraction refers to an abstract object, that abstract objects can only be referred to by terms that are introduced by abstraction. Well, now wait a minute. I could introduce a name for my surperson. Probably Brandom would be a good name for my surperson. Now, Brandom was not introduced by abstraction. I just named something. Now, the surperson that it named, well, that I would introduce by abstraction. Well, what is the relation between introducing terms by abstraction and kinds of things? Here, Sellars is taking a very different attitude, indeed a diametrically opposed attitude to introducing terms by abstraction than he is to introducing terms by theoretical postulation. He says you can introduce terms by theoretical postulation, but there is not a kind of thing that is theoretical things, theoretical entities. That idea is an instrumentalist fallacy. But we have this other way of introducing terms by abstraction, and he says, yeah, and nothing that's referred to that way exists. I'm a nominalist about that. Now, actually, it's only a subset of abstractions that he wants to say that for, but the reason I wanted to start with abstraction is because it's so striking that abstraction is a process, it's a thing you can do, introducing new terms, and yet nominalists about abstract objects say, and there aren't any such things. Those terms don't refer. Sometimes, as with Goodman and Quine, sort of the classic mid-2010 nominalists, they say, well, all of them are sets, and it's sets that don't exist. But the question is, why should you treat introducing theoretical terms by postulation as not drawing an ontological line, it's not having metaphysical significance, but treat introducing terms by abstraction as drawing an ontological line, such that you then make a non-existence claim about half of them. You refuse, you withhold existential commitment from any term that's introduced by abstraction. That's a fundamental question about how the different parts of Sellars' view hold together. So I wanted to put that on the table so we can be keeping books on the things he says that address that question. Okay. Now, I said that universals are introduced by abstraction, but not everything that's introduced by an abstraction is a universal. And strictly, Sellars is only going to be a nominalist about, well, that's not quite true either. Mainly what he's a nominalist about is universals. He's also a nominalist about propositions, which are not universals. They don't have instances in the way that triangularity has triangles as instances. But let me say something about nominalism about universals, because it's older and sometimes it's just sort of universals. So this was a big topic among the medieval scholastic philosophers. There were many reasons for that. Mostly how you thought God's thoughts were related to reality. But the three basic approaches to universals got worked out very well by the medievals. Realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. Realism, most sophisticated scholastic realist was Duns Scotus. Says universals are real, they're objective, they're every bit as much a part of the world as particulars are. Charles Sanders Peirce, founder of American pragmatism, throughout his life, one of the early themes that continued to be important to him was realism about universals. And Duns Scotus was his hero for that reason. Sellars, when he talks about this tradition, calls it rationalist rather than realist. It's belief in real connections, he says. It's tangled up with views about modality, even though one can separate these. I'll mention what the connections are in a minute in connection with David Armstrong's view about universals. Nominalism, here the most sophisticated avatar is William of Ockham. Says universals don't exist. All that exists is names of them, predicates. Respects of similarity in the world, there aren't any in the world. The only respect of similarity the two things have is if we have the same name for them. Our linguistic practices are just projected onto the world. And this was hugely influential. It's why this view gets called nominalism. It's all names, no genuine respects of similarity, universals, qualities. A third view, is it a vea media? Not sure. Conceptualism, here it's Peter Abelard is the avatar of conceptualism. Universals are real, but they're in the mind. Some of them are in our mind, some of them are in God's mind, but to talk about universals is to talk about mental items. But there's more to it than just names. These are real qualities, but they're not out there. Quine identifies intuitionism in the philosophy of mathematics as a conceptualist position about mathematical entities. In views about universals, about qualities, over the last 75 years or so, I think there's four main approaches. The first one is Goodman and Quine. And Quine is speaking for this a little bit in the On What There Is essay. I'll have us read later on the Goodman and Quine nominalism essay because that's a classic statement of it. As I say, they make without argument the identification of all abstract objects with sets, and so think of qualities as sets. Triangularity is the set of all triangles. Redness is the set of all red things. Lionhood is the set of all lions. And they say, and sets are bad. There aren't any sets. Not really. Now, exactly what should we say about it? It's a façon de parler. You can see why Plato's beard would be a problem here. What do you mean there aren't any sets? What is the content of that claim? But though this is not where Sellars comes in, everybody writing in the 50s and 60s about this topic was sort of starting with Goodman and Quine's complaints about set theory. So I wanted to fill in a little bit of the background to make sure we're together on that. I think that there's two features of set theory that led to conceptual suspicion about it. And the first is the notion of forming unit sets. We have some object, this water bottle, and then we have the set whose only member is this water bottle. And then we have the set that has two members, this water bottle and the unit set of this water bottle. And then we can take the unit set of that set and we get a new set, and so on. See, well, this is fishy, the idea that we can just build up things out of these unit sets. The second feature, which combines with the first one, is pure set theory. Pure set theory builds everything out of the empty set. So we start with the unit set of this water bottle and the unit set of my right little finger. And we take away from this unit set, the water bottle, and we take away from this other unit set, my left little finger, and we get the same set, the empty set, the set that has no members. And in pure set theory, we build all the sets out of those. So, two ways of thinking about numbers is saying, well, we've got the empty set there, and we've got the unit set of the empty set, and we've got the unit set of the unit set. And we can just build all these sets, one corresponding to every number. Just sort of count the brackets, and there you go. That's one way of thinking about the numbers. Here's another way. Instead of just taking the unit set, we include the previous number in there, and then add the empty set in. On this account, and then one that has all of these. So the process is, I said, you could take a thing and its unit set. That's what we do here. We take the previous element, the empty set, and its unit set, and then we take those two together with their unit set to make the next element and build up from there. And these are just two ways that you can get a sequence isomorphic to the natural numbers. And in a famous and influential article in the philosophy of mathematics, Paul Benacerraf wrote What Numbers Could Not Be is the title of it. So, well, here are two different ways of constructing the numbers out of sets. What kind of fact would it be that one of them really was the number one as opposed to the other one? what kind of a fact would that be? He says, if you can't understand that fact, that kind of fact, then you have to say that these are not the numbers. They're just sort of isomorphic to the numbers. And contemporary structuralism in the philosophy of mathematics is basically downstream of that, saying, yeah, it's the structure that they have in common that we should identify with the numbers. That is, we should think about the equivalence relation that these two stand in and do an abstraction from it to get the structure that's in common. So on the structuralist account, the trouble with these is these are too concrete. The numbers are really more abstract than this. The numbers are something like the equivalence class of all of the sets of sets that are isomorphic to these sets. I mean, there's other ways to do this. Now, I said there's two moves. There's taking unit sets, and then there's moving to pure set theory where you use the empty set to build everything up. Quine says, in typical self-deprecatory fashion, well, I have a taste for desert landscapes, and I don't want to indulge in all of this. Occam's razor. Remember, here, Occam's razor, you worry about Plato's beard. What do you mean when you say these things don't exist? Goodman, I think he looked at these things, constructions that only use the empty set and allow arbitrary iteration of the unit set operation. And he just had, when he looked at that, he saw a sort of Lovecraftian horror. Like all those brackets were the tentacles of an ancient evil. And he looks at this and just says, no, that is not the way the world is. I don't want to live in a world that has those horrors in it. Now, one would like there to be, I don't know, better reasons philosophically than that. But you can see why people were, anyway, squeamish about this. And Goodman seized on and collaborated with Leonard in developing an alternative, which is mereology, which is one of the most basic constructions in contemporary metaphysics. Mereology is the logic of parts and wholes, and says, look, if you take some object A, you can put it together with B and make a whole out of that. But there isn't any whole other than A that you could then throw in. If you put A in again, you just get the whole that's made of A and B. There's nothing corresponding to the whole that is different from A, but contains A as its only part. That would be the unit set operation. You don't get, just as with sets, putting in multiple copies of an element doesn't get you a new set. If you have that, you're doing multi-sets, not sets. Well, in mereology, a whole is determined by what its parts are. And there isn't anything corresponding to either the unit set or pure wholes that don't have any parts. You can have the whole that has no parts, but if you add that as a part to anything else, you just get the anything else that you had. So you can't create these arcane horrors with a logic of parts and wholes with mereological ones. So, for instance, in what I take to be the most sophisticated contemporary form of contemporary model theory, downstream from Tarski's model theory, from possible world semantics, is Kit Fine's truthmaker framework, in which the universe of semantic interpretants is a set of worldly states and all of their mereological fusions, all of the wholes you can build out of those. And it's a semantics that assigns to each sentence as its interpretant a set of states as its truth makers and a set of states as its false makers, but the way you can combine states is mereologically, not set theoretically. So that's a huge tradition, maybe the dominant tradition, and mereological nihilists are the ones who say, yeah, and the wholes don't exist, only the parts do. And that's a defended position. David Lewis's position was that eventually physics would tell us what the ultimate particles are, and that what a possible world is a set of those ultimate particles and all of its mereological sums, all the mereological sums of those particles. That was the way Lewis preferred to think about possible worlds. Now, Quine actually broke with Goodman almost immediately by the early 50s, using, and I mention this because it's an argument that's important to Sellars, using an indispensability argument. He said, no, we naturalistically inclined ontologists, we scientific realists who take science to be the measure of all things, Sellers's phrase, should ontologically countenance whatever science needs. And if it needs sets and fields and numbers, then we should allow that there are such things. We should treat them as theoretical postulates of the science and think that because fundamental physics uses numbers, it postulates the existence of these numbers as it postulates the existence of electrons. Now we see Sellars has different attitudes towards the postulation of electrons and the postulation of numbers, if postulation is the right way to think about science's relation to the mathematical representations it uses. Sellars is going to say, no, it ain't. So this indispensability argument of Quine's is another major strand in contemporary nominalism. Third one I want to mention is David Armstrong. His 1978 book, Universals in Scientific Realism, followed up by his 1989 Universals, An Opinionated Introduction, is, the other, I think, mainstream, main current in contemporary thought about nominalism. And he's not a nominalist. He believes in universals, in properties and relations. And he does so partly motivated by the Quine indispensability argument. But it's one thing to say they're indispensable, it's something else to say what they are. And this is where I think Armstrong has been most useful. He's different from Quine and Goodman in taking alethic modalities seriously. Quine famously hostile to the notion of necessities and possibilities, talk about those things. Goodman started off that way. Goodman, by the mid-50s, in Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, has come round to an account of them, but it's a pragmatist account that is somewhere between nominalist and conceptualist, I would say. That is, he thinks of them as projections of our practices. But Armstrong takes them seriously, takes laws of nature, takes what's expressed by subjunctive conditionals, talk about what would happen if, as the lingua franca of natural science, and says universals are just roles with respect to laws, or roles with respect to subjunctively robust connections of the sort we would express using a lethic modal vocabulary. So if you want to know what the property of being copper is, look at its position, the role it plays in a network of modally robust connections to other properties. If it's copper, then it will melt at 1084 degrees C. If it's copper, then it will conduct electricity. Those sorts of connections are what define the universals. They're the nodes in networks of subjunctively robust connections. Now, one thing we might wonder is, well, why doesn't Sellars take a view like that? That's a kind of robust scientific realism. Before I leave Armstrong, I have the impression, and I'm not a specialist on this area of contemporary philosophy, that contemporary trope theory about universals, that's T-R-O-P-E, they just kidnap this word. They are very clear that their use of it has nothing to do with what trope means in English, which is a kind of linguistic expression. But trope is the term of art they seized on for instances of universals, for the particular shade of blue that this part of the petal has, this instance of it, this unrepeatable one. This particular shape that is inscribed in the metal, and these are unrepeatables in the sense that we'd say, well, that very same shape inscribed somewhere else, different token of the same type, that the tropes are the tokens. They're not repeatable. And what's distinctive of trope theory is it wants to treat repeatables as sets of tropes, or anyway combinations of tropes, and actually to treat objects, particulars, as bundles is a common term of theirs, of tropes. I mean, that's a kind of view that the medievals just didn't consider. And I think that that takes place largely in the context of an Armstrongian approach to universals. That is, they're thinking, yeah, it is these kind of actually robust connections that matter. But ontologically, we're going to start with these instances of properties and relations. so the fourth approach, I think, is Sellars' metalinguistic expressivism about universals downstream from Carnap. And that's, of course, sort of our main topic that I'm working my way up to, where, as we'll see, Sellars' basic constructive move is to say, not all repeatables, not all ones in many are universals, relate to the many, where the many are instances of the one. That's what he takes to be characteristic of universals. There's other kinds of manys, and his paradigm is lions. There's Leo, the particular lion, and then there's lions. Lion is a sortal term. Lionhood is the name of the kind, and that isn't in the world. But Leo's in the world, and so is Leonina, and these other lions. They're all in the world, and so lions are in the world. He doesn't use the term plurals here, but that's a term of art that's been used since. His nominalism, he says, that kind of one in many, the relation of lions to Leo, that's not the same as the relation of lionhood to Leo, where Leo is an instance of lionhood. No, Leo's just a lion, one of the lions. And if you think Leo's there, and you think Leonina is there, and all the other lions are there, then you think there are lions. And you can say of each of them that they're one of those, that Leo is a lion. That kind of one in many, he says, is okay. So I'm going to describe that just as a slogan, as saying plurals are okay, but properties are not. That's the line he's going to try and walk. So there's an invidious distinction between lionhood and lions, and he's got to justify that. But he's also got to reconstruct everything that he wants to say using the plurals without using the property talk. That's the constructive job. Well, for instance, that Goodman sets himself to say mereologically everything that you ought to say about how things are, without going into set theoretic terms. Once you've said this is what there is. Why do you need ones in many? Well, because you can't say anything just with singular terms, picking out particulars. You have to be able to say something about how things are, and the model for that typically is classification. This one, this many falls under this one. Can be classified under it. Let me just mention a fifth approach. Due to one of my doctor fathers, David Lewis, in a late 90s book, that he calls megathology. And I guess at some point I'll make available his essay called Mathematics is Megathology. Mega is many in Greek. Anyway, that was his excuse for this term. He also meant it to sort of pick up the resonances of mereology. You won't, here, I don't know if you ever heard this term, megathology? Nobody uses it except Lewis, though people do worry about the view, because what he does is say there's two kinds of licit aggregation of little bits into bigger bits. One is mereological. Mereology is fine. All the mereological things are there. But there's another way of putting things together. And that's, and here he helps himself to George Boulos's plural quantifiers. And megathology is what you get if you add plural quantifiers to mereology. And the reason you've never heard the term is that everybody just says mereology with plural quantifiers when they're talking about this view of Lewis. He gets a lot of mileage out of mixing these ways of putting things together. Indeed, he gets enough out of it that he not only can reconstruct everything in mathematics you can reconstruct with sets, which is pretty much mathematics, but, and this is, there's a string of recent articles criticizing this as not being nominalistic at all, because it turns out that if there's a finite number of things, then there are infinite cardinalities of things, constructible megathologically out of it. So it's really very constructively powerful to have these two ways of talking, which I think is a combination of the resources Sellars appeals to and the resources Goodman appeals to. But it isn't metalinguistic at all, so it's not like Sellars' account. So I'll mention the megathology and sort of say how this, a little bit about this later on. None of these people talk about Sellars. Armstrong mentions him, but doesn't even characterize the view. Just says Sellars has views about this too in those two books. The metalinguistic approach is not one that contemporary metaphysicians worry about or are familiar with. I think that's a shame. I think there's a lot to be said for it. And anyway, the people who care about what there is should care about this way of drawing a line between what there is and what there isn't in a nominalist spirit. But Sellars' way starts with Carnap. And Carnap in the logical syntax of language from 34 in German, 37 for the English translation, says a statement like triangularity is a property is quasi-syntactic. Book is logical syntax of language. How can we do everything with syntactic metalanguages? He said, really, it's a metalinguistic claim, but it's hidden. It's, as he would later put it, it's in the formal mode. It's a formal mode claim expressed in the material mode. That is, it's really a claim about words, but it's expressed as though it were a claim about things. So what does triangularity as a property really say? It says triangularity, the word, is a monadic predicate. That's really what you're saying. And that's why if you know how to use triangular talk, you can use triangularity and property talk, because it's just a way of expressing that. Now, Sellars wants to develop that view, in a metalinguistic expressivism. Now, I mention the expressivism here because it has important resonances with metaethical expressivism. And in particular, the metaethical expressivism of Gibbard and Simon Blackburn, which is second wave metaethical expressivism. I mean, very briefly, people like Ayer and C.L. Stevenson were first wave expressivists, had boo hurrah theories of normative, particularly moral vocabulary. And then Geach showed that that couldn't be right, or anyway was an inadequate account, because at most it was a story about freestanding uses of terms like good, but we can also use them embedded in conditionals. I can say, if that's good, that gives you a reason to do it. Well, now I haven't applauded or condemned the action. I only said if. It was embedded as the antecedent. It looks like I've described the action as being good, but you've got to have a story about those embedded uses, and that's what second wave metaethical expressivism is distinguished by. Is it's taking that seriously and saying, well, the primary use still is expressing some pro or con attitude, but on the basis of that, let us tell you about the kind of content that then is embeddable in these other things. I'll say more about this expressivist issue later on, but that's why that's part of what I'm invoking, the tradition I'm invoking in calling Sellars' view a metalinguistic expressivism. Now, this is maybe the main point of this discussion. This is what I wanted to get out on the table before our break. Sellars starts off saying, look, there's two obvious problems with this view of Carnap's. Two reasons it can't be right the way it stands, and anybody who wants to use this idea has got to have some response to these two objections. And the first one is, he says, when you say triangularity is a monadic predicate, you're really talking about the word triangular. That's why it's metalinguistic, that the characteristic of metalanguages is that they have expressions that refer to the linguistic expressions of some object language. So the quote name, triangular or is triangular, is a name in the syntactic metalanguage of that bit of the object language. But we can see that triangularity as a property isn't about the English word triangular, because we could just say it in German. Dreieckigkeit ist eine Qualität. Now, is that about the English word triangular? Well, obviously not. Sellars says somebody could say, Dreieckigkeit ist eine Qualität und es gibt keine englische Sprache. There is no such thing as the English language. Now, he'd be wrong about that part of it, but he could have that belief and still have the belief that triangularity is a property expressed in German. So at the very least, the idea that it's metalinguistic has got to deal with the fact that it doesn't seem to be about language, and translations show that. Now his response to that is going to be, well, if we construct just the right kind of quotation, we could actually do it. And that's what his dot quotes are going to do. Second problem, you say triangularity is a property What you're really doing is, in a meta-language, classifying this bit of language as a monadic predicate. But monadic predicate is a universal. Monadic predicate is itself a predicate in the meta-language. You're not getting rid of universals. You're just trading worldly universals for linguistic ones. But your meta-language still has names of universals in it, like predicate, like monadic. Oh. So you're not a nominalist, Carnap. You're some kind of linguistic idealist. You say, well, there are universals, there are properties, but they're all linguistic ones. They're just similarities of the linguistic things. Now, maybe that's an Occam-like nominalism, maybe it's an Abelard-like conceptualism, but what it isn't is getting rid of universals. It's just shrinking the set of universals from the set that includes properties of things in the world and properties of talking. You're shrinking that down to just properties of talking. But you haven't gotten rid of properties. You've still got universals there. So those are the two big objections. Sellars' response to the second one is going to be to say, well, no, there aren't properties in my meta-language for it. There's a different kind of one in many, modeled on the relation between Leo and lions, which is just talking about the particulars. Leo and the lions. He's in that set. Well, no, I shouldn't say set. He is a lion. I can enumerate all the lions, and he's one of them. That I can say. So the particular bit of conceptual machinery that he'll introduce to respond to that second issue is distributive singular terms. The lion is a distributive singular term. Paradigmatic use of that is the lion is tawny. But that use is translatable as lions are tawny. And so doesn't invoke a property of being a lion. Okay, so Sellars wants to run with Carnap's idea. He thinks it's basically right, but there are these two serious hurdles to it. It doesn't seem to be metalinguistic. In what sense is it about language? It can't be the sense that Carnap said it was. And how can we specify what it does without using universals, using qualities, committing ourselves to those in the meta-language, qualities of linguistic expressions? Okay, why don't we take a 15-minute break now, come back at a quarter of, and I'll talk about those constructive responses. All right. So I want to commend to your attention the map of the Grammar and Existence essay that I put on the web there. This is the thing I mean, just so you know, because I don't want to talk about the first half of the essay really. I think that's ground clearing and stage setting on his part. Basically, he considers two bad arguments for thinking that just in talking the way we do, we're committed to the existence of universals. And the one is, he cites Geach on this, that we do use predicate quantifiers. We do say something like, there is something that Tim and Tom both are. They're both tall. And he just thinks that's not an argument for our being committed to singular terms that refer to those things. Tall isn't a singular term. It's still a predicate. And the fact that we quantify over them doesn't turn them into singular terms, doesn't make us committed to there being things that are, triangularity, tallness. We're not committed to by saying there is something that they are both, that they both are. That's a predicate, not a singular term. And what he's objecting to is the singular terms. So he puts that to one side. And then there's a semantic argument. Well, isn't what we do with language describe things? How are we describing things with predicates? Well, what are they referring to? That's using the name bearer model, the name of Fido and Fido as your sole semantic model, and saying, what is it that a predicate stands to in the way the dog Fido stands to his name Fido? And Sellars says that's a bad semantics. That's not the way to think about the semantics of predicates. He's got another way, think about it in terms of functional classification. He doesn't say enough in this essay or really in abstract entities to fill that in. But we can fill it in. We will do that. So he thinks bad argument from predicate quantification, bad argument from applying the semantics of names to predicates. Basically, he thinks that second argument is the real challenge. He thinks is what he calls categorizing contexts, and that's like triangularity is a property, because triangularity is a proper singular term. Property is a sortal that it falls under. That's the two kinds of terms, singular and sortal. Sortal giving us the criteria of identity and individuation for objects. That's talk about what there is. That's the form of talk about what there is. So what are we going to say about that? So the whole first half of the essay is just saying don't worry about those first two arguments. And then I think he realized that the treatment in the second half of Grammar and Existence, he indicates what his view is, but he doesn't really lay it out very clearly or very well. 5 years later, he writes Abstract Entities and just focuses on that argument. And I will put on the website a sort of walk through the passages I extracted from the AE essay with light commentary on them, so that you can catch him saying some of the things that I'm going to attribute to him. But he says we got to have an account of categorizing contexts. I'm going to give a metalinguistic account following Carnap. Basically, what Sellars learned from Carnap was a way of thinking about concepts that philosophers had found problematic, that wasn't simply scientistic. It didn't just say, oh, well, if the scientists don't talk about that, there isn't anything there to worry about, but was still something he, as a scientific realist, who thought that in the business of saying what there is in the world, science is the measure of all things, could be comfortable with. And what he learned from Carnap is, well, in addition to what's out there that in the way of material objects that the natural scientist is the authority on, there's us and our discursive practices. And there are features of our practices that we talk about in meta-languages. And the program is to take every philosophically problematic concept and either dismiss it, say, no, that actually was just a confusion, or reconstruct it in metalinguistic terms as only apparently talking about what's out there in material reality, but really talking about ourselves, being part of our self-consciousness rather than of our consciousness of the way other things are. And most substantial test bench for that is the treatment of universals. Okay, so, and as I said before the break, the two big problems are, look, the claim triangularity is a property just does not seem to be about the word triangular. So, in what sense is it metalinguistic? Sellars is writing after Carnap had already branched out and acknowledged metalanguages that were not syntactic metalanguages, but following Tarski, that were semantic metalanguages. The young Sellars has added pragmatic metalanguages to that, metalanguages in which we talk about what we do. What can he do? What can he do here with that first problem, which, as I say, comes up in the context of translations. That brings home the sense in which, anyway, emphasizes a sense in which claims about triangularity are not about the word triangular. But he insists there still is a sense in which it's about the word triangular. And what's needed is for us to construct a kind of quotation that we can see going on in this, a kind of metalinguistic construction that we can see as going on here. Now, I think a model for this is the relation between direct quotation and indirect quotation. If I'm characterizing what you said, I can do it in direct quotation using quotation marks and reciting the exact words that you used. So I can say, John said, quote, I'm confused on that point. And using those quotation marks insulates what's inside the quotation marks from the context of my utterance. So normally when I use the word I, it refers to Bob, but not when I say, John said, quote, I'm a bit confused on that point. The I occurring inside the quotation marks isn't evaluated from the point of view of the circumstances of my utterance. It's evaluated from the point of view of the circumstances of the utterance I'm reporting instead. And similarly with languages. I can say, so to finish this, that's the way the direct quotation works. But if I say, John said that he's a little confused on this point, if I put it in indirect quotations, I use the that instead of the quotation marks, now the personal pronoun gets evaluated in my circumstances. And I'd be saying something incorrect if I said, John said that I'm a little confused on that point. That's not what he said, whether I'm used or not. So the difference between direct and indirect quotation shifts the context of evaluation of pronouns, for instance. And it also shifts quotations. In indirect quotation, I could say, Wittgenstein ends the Tractatus by saying that of which one cannot speak, one should be silent. Now, he said it in German, but I'm characterizing what he said in indirect quotation. I do it in English. But if I do it in direct quotation with the quotation marks, I have to say Wittgenstein ended the Tractatus by saying, quote, wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. I don't put it in the language of my utterance. I have to put it in the language of his utterance if it's a direct quotation. So there's two different kinds of quotation that differ on what the rules are for the point of view from which you're specifying the content of what somebody else said. And Sellars is going to give us a third kind of quotation, dot quotation, with the illustrating sign design principle. So here's how it goes. He wants us to think of meaning in terms of functional classification. When you say what something means, you're functionally classifying it. You're saying what role it plays with respect to language moves and language entry and exit transitions. Describing the functional role or specifying somehow the functional role that it plays. So when I say in German, the word rot means red, he says, I'm using the term red, but I'm not referring to something out in the world that is red. I'm functionally classifying what he's saying. Now, I can make terms that refer to those functional roles. Is that the way to start? Yeah. The thought that I'm expressing is that the word rot on the other side of the Rhine plays the same role that our word red plays around here. Now it's related to Farben rather than to colors, but again, Farben and colors play the same functional role. So I can say what the functional role of rot is in German by giving you an instance of it in my language, red. So he says, when I do that, I could put special quotations around red to indicate that it's playing this functional classifying role, and say, rot, in quotation, in ordinary quotation marks, that sign design, that repeatable word in German, to say that it plays the same role that the word red plays in my language, I could say it is a dot red, dot quoted red. And I'm using dot quote around my word to pick out a functional role, which rot can play and rouge can play, and so on. Now, this isn't the idea of names for functional roles. That's not a uniquely Sellarsian idea. When I first came to Pitt and Sellars was still extant, one of my colleagues was Chad Hansen, specialist in Chinese philosophy, spent most of his career in Hong Kong. The reason he wanted to be at Pittsburgh with Sellars was that his understanding of Chinese characters, Hanzi, Japanese kanji, is that they were the names of functional roles that things could play. That's why the many different spoken languages of China can use the same writing system, is because the characters are, well, they get messed up with phonetic things too, but really is an ideographic system that has names for these conceptual roles, so that spoken languages that are not mutually intelligible can use the same written scheme. A small anecdote, the first time I was in Hong Kong, in the hotel, I was switching between two television stations, both of which were showing the same American movie, one of them dubbed in Mandarin with Cantonese subtitles, and the other dubbed into Cantonese with Mandarin subtitles, and the subtitles were all the same. So one wondered, well, why are there two television stations here? Well, you got to hear it in the one, but the Mandarin and the Cantonese, not mutually intelligible, quite different languages, and yet one set of subtitles was fine for it. So his interest in sort of Sellarsian semantics was thinking of the Chinese Hanzi as the names of functional roles, that the character for red is referring to what rot and red and rouge all have in common. Now, having said that, the dot-quoted expression dot red is not a name. It's a sortal. The right way to use it is to say rots, so ordinary quotation mark, R-O-T, quotation mark, and then S, so instances of the sign design rot are dot reds, dot R-E-D dot S. They are reds. This is going to be modeled on Leo is a lion, or, I don't know, cubs are lions, let's say. Rots are dot reds. That's the kind of thing they are. Now, how am I specifying that kind? I'm using a word in my language that plays that role in order to pick out the sortal, in order to specify the sortal. That red in there is the illustrating sign design. I pick out the functional role by giving you an example of it, an illustration of it. If you want to know what functional role rots play, it's the same one that red plays. That's what I'm saying. It's of that kind. Even that he doesn't want to say. It falls under that sortal. That's what I'm classifying it as. And the thing is, when I translate that, if I were to say that in German, to say rot ist ein Punkt. Rot, I say then, because the rule is that the illustrating sign design is in the language that I'm speaking. In that way, it's like indirect quotation and not like direct quotation. So these are the three, I guess, crucial features of it. You use dot-quoted expressions to functionally classify the role that something plays in a language. That's what it is generally. You do that by placing an illustration from your language between two dots, a sign design that in your language plays the role that you're classifying the foreign expression as playing. And it does so by forming a sortal. This last is important for his response to the second worry, that he's just introducing more properties. They're just linguistic properties. Because he's saying, well, some ones in many, some kinds of repeatable expressions are okay, and others aren't. Sortals are okay, but nouns formed from predicate adjectives aren't. So lion is okay, but triangularity and lionhood are not. Sortals are okay, but nominalizations of expressions that are not singular terms are not okay. So he says, when you're saying triangularity is a property, you are talking about linguistic expressions. You're talking about inter alia, about the English word triangular. But you're equally talking about the German word Dreieck. It's just, you're talking about the functional role that they play. And you're specifying that functional role by giving an instance. And that instance is in your language, not in the other language. So it's like indirect quotation rather than direct quotation in that respect. And now he says, well, so the translation into German of triangularity is equality. It is a, I don't know why I did quality instead of Eigenschaft. But anyway, triangularity is a property. Yeah, if Fritz is saying this, he's going to say, Dreieckigkeit ist eine Qualität or eine Eigenschaft. Eine Eigenschaft, I guess. And the translation for that in German is going to be quote, Dreieckigs sind dot triangularity is a property. Is going to be dreieckig, in quotes, ist ein dot dreieckig. Because he's saying that in German, and so he's going to specify the functional role that he's classifying it as playing in German. So the fact that it behaves weirdly on translation doesn't mean we're not talking about language. It just means we're talking about language in a more complicated way, a way that involves not the particular sign design, but the functional role it plays. But the particular sign design is used to specify what that role is. And he gives us the rules for doing that will keep us from getting into trouble. So on the constructive side, he's got a construction, really. Let me explain to you this technical usage, this new form of quotation, dot quotes, how it works. That's the sense of metalinguistic. It's the same sense in which classifying things using dot quotation, functionally classifying them using dot quotation does. And it's not the case that triangularity refers to the dot triangular. It doesn't. Triangularity doesn't refer to anything. That's his nominalism. So that's the first move. He has invoked it in putting to one side the second argument in the first half of GE, and we remember it from meaning as functional classification that we looked at briefly a couple of weeks ago. The second one is more complicated in its details, but is, I think, generally easy to understand. He gives us an example of the difference between what's referred to by dot quotes and what's referred to by ordinary quotes. In the form of Texas chess, or as he calls it at one point, TESS, short for Texas chess. So you might think that a pawn has this, is a piece of wood that has this particular sort of shape. You're thinking about the sign design. You're thinking about what corresponds to a quote name of it. But really, when you're talking about pawns, you're talking about the role they play in chess. And things with very different shapes can play that role. When he's writing this in around 1960, these cute little bug cars, the Volkswagens, had just been introduced. All the rage, and they were nothing like the cars that other people, the people were used to, the American cars, which were the big, mile-long cars. So he imagines Texas chess, where the squares on the board are counties in Texas, because they just drew the lines like that. And the pieces are cars. The king, of course, is a Cadillac. Quine is an Oldsmobile. Volkswagens are the pawns. And you play it by driving from one county to the other. Everything's big in Texas, chess, and chess is. So he says, both, and we can draw a little sort of wooden pawn, this and the Volkswagen, those both play the role of the pawn. They're both dot pawns, if you like. I mean, not because pawn is a word and they're not, but they're analogous. We could specify the role. Well, we could specify the role by talking about the pawn. We could say they are each a pawn, meaning they play the role of the pawn. We could say that. About them. Functionally classifying them. Now, the second objection was that we were trading universals in the world, properties in the world, for properties of linguistic expressions. And he wants to say, well, you might do that, but that's not what he's going to do. He needs some kind of one in many, some kind of repeatable. Maybe I should, it's probably worth saying something about this here. In other places, he uses as a generic distinction repeatable and unrepeatable. And that's useful in many ways. The tradition tended to think in terms of genus and species. As kinds of repeatables. A philosopher named Johnson, around 1900, pointed out that not all repeatables took subject-predicate form. that took species genus form, that where it does, you can specify the species by specifying the genus and its differentia. So the thought was, humans are rational animals. Animals, that's a species, specific difference, they're rational. But he pointed out that, for instance, colors are not like that. You can say red is a color, okay, that's the genus, but what's the differentia? Well, it's red. There isn't more to, there isn't anything other than it to use as the differentia. He called those determinates and determinables. So those are different kinds of relations of repeatables. John McDowell, in various places, criticizes philosophers of mind who, to his mind, uncritically use Peirce's distinction between types and tokens for intentional states. Peirce's distinction is Peirce's distinction is if that's not too late, is it? Okay. If I put a square on the board that has, I draw a picture, and ask how many letters are in the box. Well, there's 3 tokens and 2 types. Letter is ambiguous between the token and the type. There's 2 A's and an E, 3 tokens, but just 2 types. And you might think that that type-token distinction is generically usable for repeatables and unrepeatables, for things in their instances. And people typically do talk about the difference between my token belief that, for instance, that Paris is the capital of France, and your token belief of it. They're of the same type, but different tokens. And McDowell says, look, this type token language presumes that there's a specification of the instances apart from the content that they have. In the case of belief, to talk about token beliefs presupposes that there's a non-intentional way of specifying the state that I have and the state that you have. That is a specification of it, not in terms of the content that's shared by them. And he denies that. He thinks intentional states only have intentional specifications. Any other specification is not a specification of your belief. It's a specification of something else. Okay, all of that is maybe making too heavy weather of the point that there are different kinds of repeatables. There's different ways in which something can stand as a one over against a many, characterizing it as, in some sense, a repeatable, that they are unrepeatable. Well, Sellars doesn't want us to say instances of, because the notion of one and many is broader than that. When I say Leo's a lion, he's just one of the lions. Lion is not something he's an instance of. He's an instance of lionhood. He has the property of lionhood, but he just is a lion. He's one of the lions. Lions is plural, and if you count them all, he's one of the ones you would count. Sellars' nominalism says this is the most important distinction. It's the distinction that's ontologically significant between ones in many that have instances and those that don't. Now, starting next week, we're going to ask, why in the world, where would you draw the line there? Why would you think that that line is so important? And that question will be with us for some time. But roughly his view is the world is a world of things. That's a world of particulars. Facts are among the things that there aren't, in the narrow sense, in the world. And those things are particulars. All of them are particulars. But there are also groups of particulars. Those particulars can be, I was going to say of a kind, but kind is a term we're not allowed to use. But some of the particulars that are out there are lions. And by lion, we just mean those particulars, but we mean it in this plural way. We can use a sortal, understood as a plural, for them. So his strategy for responding to the second problem with the Carnapian sort of flat-footed metalinguistic account is he does need linguistic ones in many, but he has to argue that they're better than worldly universals, not just in being linguistic rather than being worldly. Indeed, not that at all. We should think about the world as containing ones in many that are of this plural sort, as well as the language. So his strategy is to do all the explicative and explanatory work that he thinks needs to be done, only appealing to this kind of one in many, to this sortals understood as plurals sort of thing. Now, let me introduce another perspective on this distinction. It's a distinction between adjectival predicates and sortal predicates, between red and lion. Now, the Aristotelian tradition had taken sortal predicates to be ontologically fundamental, substance terms, things you could count, principles of individuation. Indeed, predicate adjectives were of a sort of secondary, accidental ontological character in that tradition. But starting with Frege, the analytic tradition turned things around and understood the basic notion to be predicate adjectives, like red or square, because they have criteria of application. What has to be true of something for it to be red or square, and consequences of application, so they stand in inferential relations. But sortal terms have those too, so criteria of application for something being a lion or a dog, and consequences of application for that. But they also have, sortal predicates also have criteria of identity and individuation. The question of whether this is the same lion as that makes sense in a way that it doesn't for red. Or rather, if we ask, is this the same red as that, we really mean, is this the same shade of red? Or is this the same sample of red? But red by itself doesn't come with that. And triangular doesn't either. It's a predicate adjective. Is this the same triangular as that? You say, well, what do you mean? Is it, are they both equilateral? Are they both isosceles? We're adding a classifier in order to do it. So in recent philosophical tradition, the adjectives that don't have criteria of identity and individuation with them, the predicate adjectives, are treated as sort of more basic. That's the general kind. And then some among them also have criteria of identity and individuation. Frege introduces this interestingly to point out that the application of number is sortally relative. He says, if I give you a pack of cards and ask how many is this, well, you need the sortal. How many cards? It's 52. How many suits? It's 4. How many differently numbered cards? Well, there's 13 different numbers on them. You need a sortal, something you can count. Just giving me the thing doesn't tell me how to count it. If you want to know how many cards there are, yes, there's an answer to that question. Sellars thinks sortals are a kind of term. The sortal lion, which codifies the criteria of identity and individuation for lions, for that kind of particular, that's part of the naming particulars apparatus. You can't have singular terms without having sortal terms, because the sortal terms determine how to count them, how to identify and individuate them. So he says, I'm a nominalist in that I think that what there is in the world can be named, and that's proper particulars and the sortals that go with them thought of just as plurals of the particulars. The lions is all those lions, Leo, Leonina, and so on. Now, let me... So, in the passages, you will find this at 167 in A and E. If, therefore, we can understand the relation of the lion, one, to lions, many, to say the lion is tawny is just to say lions are tawny, in the way in which to say the pawn can move 1 square forward is to say pawns can move 1 square forward, without construing the lion as a universal of which lions are instances, and similarly pawn, this would enable a distinction between a generic use of abstract entity, in which the lion and the pawn, as well as triangularity, construed as the dot triangular, and that 2 plus 2 equals 4, construed as the dot 2 plus 2 equals 4, would be abstract entities in the sense of being ones over and against manys, and they're not all bad, and a narrower sense of abstract entities, the ones he's not willing to be existentially committed to, as being ones over manys, in which qualities, relations, sorts, classes, propositions, and the like, he says, are abstract entities. But of those, only a proper subset, universals but not propositions, for instance, would be ones as over and against instances or members. So qualities have instances, propositions don't, but they're both bad, those two classes. Those don't exist. Whereas some of the ones and manys in the more general case are okay. And this culminates, and this is something you will have to stare at, but I commend it to your attention, in section 7, pages 188 to 189, he says, the lion is a distributive individual. The lion is just a way of talking about lions. And it's not a kind, which is to say that the lion is a distributive singular term and not a common noun. Yeah, I can see. I'm going to read this, but I've not said enough to make this intelligible yet. I'll have to start there next time. Lion kind is a kind and not a distributive individual, which he translates as saying the lion, in dots, is a distributive singular term and not is a common noun and not a distributive singular term. Lion kind is a distributive individual and not a kind. Dot the dot lion dot is a distributive singular term and not a common noun, and so on. All I mean to be doing at this point is waving at all the fine distinctions that he's going to be able to make of kinds of ones and many, given the formation of what he calls distributive singular terms like the lion and also the pawn, but also the dot red is also a distributive singular term that encompasses all of quote, quote, and quote, rouge. And by combining these two bits of apparatus, the formation of dot quotes of sortals with dot quotes, and the formation of distributive singular terms from them, he can make a variety of distinctions that are way finer than philosophers who worried about nominalism, abstract entities, and universals have made. And this passage on 188 and 189, where he maps sort of ordinary philosophical talk onto his technical talk, is a tour de force showing all of the things he can do. So I do want to walk through that, but it's going to take more time than we have right now. So I'll start off with that next time. I hope I've at least gotten on the table the apparatus that he uses and some flavor of the kind of view he's going to defend with these weaker sorts of ones and many. As I say, the overriding issue is going to be what motivation does he have? What reasons does he have for drawing the lines where he does? But what we're talking about now is, well, what apparatus does he have for drawing lines before we say which ones really matter? So I'll pick that up next time. You need to read both essays for next time, the naming and saying and the empiricism and abstract entities. The latter one is very crude, it's very early, but it's where he talks about the motivation for it. That's what you look for that. Okay, thank you. See you next time.